In the autumn of 1881, a fleet of small wooden sloops began dropping blocks of gray granite into the open water at the mouth of Rockland Harbor on the coast of Maine. Each block weighed anywhere from half a ton to more than 2.5 tons, and each one vanished beneath the surface of Penobscot Bay the moment it left the derrick. There was no wall to see yet. There was only deep, cold water and a line on a map. The Army engineer who had promised the government this could be done was a man named Colonel George Thorne, and the quarry company that won the first contract to feed him stone belonged to a Maine granite man named Joseph R. Bodwell, who would be elected governor of the state within 5 years and dead within 6. Between the two of them, they had set out to sink nearly a mile of solid granite into the Atlantic Ocean, one block at a time, by hand, until the wall they were building rose up out of the sea and stood in daylight. I went looking for how that was even possible. What I found is one of the strangest and most stubborn feats of plain American labor on the entire eastern seaboard, and almost no one who walks out on it today knows what is under their feet. So let me show you what it actually took and why a small lime town in Maine decided to wall off the ocean. To understand why anyone would try to build a stone wall a mile long out in the open sea, you have to understand what Rockland was in the 1800s, because it was not a sleepy fishing village. It was one of the busiest industrial harbors in the country, and it had a nickname that tells you everything. They called it the Lime City. The hills behind Rockland and the neighboring town of Rockport were veined with limestone, and for most of the 19th century, that limestone was burned in tall stone kilns until it broke down into quicklime, the white powder that went into the mortar and the plaster of a building nation. By 1854, the district was running something like 12 active quarries and 125 lime kilns, and it had become the leading producer of lime in the United States. At its peak in the 1880s, Rockland was shipping out as much as 1.5 million barrels of lime in a single year. The whole economy of the place ran on stone, burned into powder and sent away by sea. The making of that lime was an industry unto itself, and it ran on the same hand labor as everything else in this story. The limestone was dug out by hand from a maze of quarries on the backside of the city, and a whole local railroad, the Lime Rock Railroad, was built for the single purpose of hauling that heavy stone over to the kilns crowded along the harbor front. At the kilns, the broken limestone was dumped in from the top and burned for days over fires fed by cordwood, much of it spruce carried in by schooner. The heat drove the carbon dioxide out of the stone and left behind the pure white quicklime, which was then packed hot into watertight wooden casks and rushed down to the waiting ships. For more than a century, the kilns along Rockland's waterfront burned almost without stopping, and the glow of them at night was one of the sights of the Maine coast. The whole machine, the quarries, the railroad, the kilns, and the fleet existed to turn Maine stone into American mortar and send it to sea. To understand why a safe harbor mattered so much, you have to understand how fragile lime is as a cargo. Quicklime is hungry stuff. The moment it touches water, it reacts, and the reaction throws off real heat. A barrel of fresh lime that got wet in a ship's hold did not just spoil. It could catch fire from the inside, and a lime fire aboard a wooden schooner was one of the most feared things in the coasting trade because you could not put it out with water, since the water only fed it. The whole business therefore depended on keeping the lime dry from the kiln to the wharf to the hold, and that meant it depended on calm, controlled loading. A harbor where the swell ran in and threw the schooners against the wharves was not just inconvenient for Rockland. It was a direct threat to the one cargo the town had to sell, and it all left by water. There were no trucks and no interstate. Every barrel of lime that Rockland made had to be loaded onto a sailing vessel and carried down the coast to Boston, to New York, to Philadelphia, and on to the ports of the South. In a single year, some 300 vessels worked out of that harbor, and on a busy day, the water was crowded with the masts of schooners, waiting their turn at the wharves to be loaded. There were so many of these coasting vessels carrying Rockland lime that they became a fixture of the entire eastern seaboard, a steady fleet of small wooden ships running the powdered stone of one Maine town to every growing city on the coast. Rockland was not just a town on the sea. It was a town that lived or died by whether ships could lie safely in its harbor and take on cargo. And there was the problem, because Rockland Harbor was wide open to the north and east. It faced straight out into Penobscot Bay and the broad Atlantic beyond, with nothing to break the run of the water. When the weather turned, the harbor turned dangerous. In the 1850s, hard storms drove straight in off the bay, raced across the open water with nothing to slow them, and battered the developed shoreline where the wharves and the kilns and the warehouses stood. Vessels at anchor were thrown around and some were wrecked outright. A harbor full of valuable ships and a shoreline full of valuable industry sat exposed to every gale that the North Atlantic cared to send. The town that fed the country its lime could not protect the one thing it depended on most, which was a safe place to load a ship. The lesson was as plain in Maine as it had been anywhere. A working harbor without shelter is a harbor waiting to lose its fleet. The first serious answer came from a young Army engineer. In 1856, Lieutenant John Newton of the Corps of Engineers studied the harbor and made the case to the government that Rockland needed a breakwater, a long artificial barrier reaching out into the bay to take the force of the sea and leave calm water behind it. Newton counted the stakes carefully. He noted that around 300 ships were owned right there in the district and roughly 200 more came into trade, and that the entire lime business depended on those ships being able to ride safely at anchor. He drew up an estimate for the work, and he put the price at about $156,742. It was a sober and reasonable plan. And then, like so many sober and reasonable plans of that era, it sat. The money did not come. The Civil War came instead, and swallowed the nation's attention and the nation's treasury whole, and Rockland kept loading its lime in an open harbor and praying about the weather for another generation. It was not until 1880 that Washington finally moved. In that year, the 46th Congress appropriated the first money for the work, a modest $20,000 to begin, and the job at last had a foothold. The Army Corps of Engineers took charge, and the officer who carried it forward in those first years was Colonel George Thorne. Thorne studied the harbor and the bottom and the run of the waves, and he reported up to the Chief of Engineers that the thing could be done. But Thorne made one decision early that shaped everything that followed, and it is the decision that makes this wall unlike almost any other the Army built in that century. He decided that the breakwater would be built entirely of granite, and that the granite would all come from right there on Penobscot Bay. That was not the obvious choice. Most great harbor works of the age mixed their materials, used rubble and concrete, and whatever was cheapest to haul. But Rockland sat in the middle of one of the richest granite districts in America, and the engineers chose to use what the bay itself offered. The Rockland breakwater is believed to be the only breakwater the Army Corps built in the entire 19th century made exclusively of local stone. Every block that went into it was quarried within sight of the water it was sunk in. The harbor would be walled off with the very islands that surrounded it. If the idea of an entire generation moving stone and water by hand is the kind of history you came here for, I want to tell you that the great American story that started all of this, the Erie Canal, the waterway that the very same generation dug across New York with nothing but shovels and wheelbarrows and black powder, is now a full illustrated book. You can scan the code on your screen and start reading it tonight. To wall off an ocean, you first have to cut the wall out of a mountain, and that work began in the quarries of Penobscot Bay. The man whose company would supply the first stone is worth knowing because his life runs along the same hand labor thread as the wall itself. Joseph Robinson Bodwell was born in Methuen, Massachusetts in 1818, and he started out with nothing, working as a farm laborer. He learned the granite trade the hardest way there is, by hauling stone for a dam being built on the Merrimack River, carrying granite down from New Hampshire to the growing mill town of Lawrence. That is the detail I keep coming back to. The man who would help wall off a Maine harbor had learned his trade hauling stone for a river dam by hand, the same kind of grinding labor that built so much of the country in those years. From the Merrimack, he went north into Maine with a single yoke of oxen, joined up with a partner named Moses Webster, and out of that small start, built the Bodwell Granite Company into one of the largest employers in the entire state. By the time the Rockland breakwater needed stone, his company was one of the great granite operations on the eastern coast. The granite came from the islands around Rockland, above all from Vinalhaven, where Joseph Bodwell and his partner had built one of the largest stone operations in the state. The way they got the stone out of the ground is a story all its own, and it was almost entirely a story of muscle. To split a block free from the living ledge, two men worked together at a single steel drill. One man held the drill upright against the stone and gave it a quarter turn after every blow, and the other man swung a heavy sledge down onto the head of it, over and over, hour after hour. They called it double jacking, and a good pair could sink a line of holes into solid granite by sheer rhythm and endurance. Once the line of holes was drilled, the quarrymen split the block the old way, with what they called plug and feather. Into each hole they slid two thin curved shims of steel, the feathers, and between them they set a tapered steel wedge, the plug. Then they went down the whole line, tapping the plugs deeper, one light blow at a time, walking the row again and again, until the steady pressure of all those wedges acting together found the natural grain of the stone, and the granite simply opened along a clean, straight line, as if it had been waiting to. There was a real art in it. A skilled splitter could read the grain of a ledge and take off a block the size of a wagon with a face as flat as a table, using nothing but drills and wedges and patience. The men who did this work were not all local. The Granite Islands of Maine drew stonecutters from across New England and from across the ocean, from Sweden and Norway, from Scotland and Ireland and Italy, men who carried the craft of cutting stone in their hands and their families and brought it to the cold coast of Penobscot Bay. At the height of the boom in the 1880s and 1890s, the granite industry on Vinalhaven alone employed well over 1,000 men, more than half the people on the island. They lived hard and they worked in all weather, and the stone they took out of those quarries did not only build the Rockland Wall. Vinalhaven granite went into the Washington Monument and into the United States Capitol and into great public buildings up and down the Atlantic coast. The same hands that walled off a small Maine harbor were cutting the stone of the national capital. Moving the granite from the quarry face to the water was its own ordeal, because these were not small stones. The blocks bound for the breakwater ran from about half a ton to more than 2.5 tons each, and to shift weights like that without an engine, the quarrymen used a strange and ingenious wagon called a gallimander. A gallimander was a heavy wooden cart, roughly 18 feet long, built low and strong, fitted with a lifting boom and a rope tackle worked by hand. The crew would lower the boom, sling the block, crank it up off the ground until it swung clear under the frame, and then hitch as many as 8 horses to the whole rig and haul the stone down to the loading wharf. Block by block, the granite came off the islands and down to the sloops that would carry it out to be drowned. Now we come to the part that still stops me when I picture it, which is how you actually build a wall in water you cannot see the bottom of. The stone was loaded onto wooden sailing sloops, and those sloops carried it out to the working end of the breakwater. The vessels were rigged so that a derrick could be worked right off the ship's own masts, a boom and tackle reaching out over the side. The crew would swing a granite block out over the water, and then they would lower it down into the bay and let it go. There was no foundation poured first, no cofferdam pumped dry. They simply began dropping stone onto the floor of the harbor and let the stone find its own footing in the mud and rock below. What they were building, course by sunken course, was a long trapezoid of rough granite rising up from the seabed. The base of it, down in the dark, spread out enormously wide to give the whole mass a footing the ocean could not undercut. And as the wall climbed toward the surface, it narrowed. The seaward face, the side that took the open Atlantic, was given a long, gentle slope of about 30 degrees, so that a wave running in off the bay would ride up the incline and break and spend its force against the rising stone, rather than slamming into a flat wall. The harbor side was built steeper. Smaller rock was packed into the gaps as fill, and the great blocks were dry laid, set without mortar, held in place by nothing but their own colossal weight and the careful fit of stone against stone. They were not gluing a wall together. They were stacking one so heavy and so well shaped that the sea could not take it apart. There is a deep logic in that sloping shape, and it is worth understanding, because it is the whole reason the wall has lasted. A wave is not a wall of water moving forward. It is energy traveling through water, and when it meets an obstacle, that energy has to go somewhere. If you put a flat vertical face in front of a big sea, the wave hits it like a hammer and all of its force is thrown straight back at the stone again and again, until something cracks or shifts or is dragged away. But if you give the wave a long, gentle ramp to climb, the energy is spread out across the whole slope. The wave rides up the incline, loses its punch against the rising stone, breaks into white water near the top, and slides back down, having done no real harm. That is why the seaward face of the Rockland breakwater was laid at that long 30-degree angle, and why the underwater base was spread so impossibly wide. The engineers were not just stacking stone. They were shaping the ocean's own force into something the wall could survive. They built the breakwater to be hit and to win. It is worth sitting with how blind and how patient that work was. A man on the deck of a sloop, lowering a 2-ton block over the side, could not see where it was going to land. He was building onto a wall that lived almost entirely underwater, judging by soundings and by experience and by the slow rise of the structure beneath him, trusting that block after block, year after year, the trapezoid down below was climbing true toward the light. Imagine the discipline of it. There was no engine to lift the stone, no diver in modern gear to set it, no machine to tell a man whether the block he had just dropped had landed square or rolled. The crews learned to read the water and the lead line, to feel the wall through the rope and the swell, and to keep faith that the careful work of one day was sitting right on the careful work of the day before, all the way down to the dark floor of the bay. For most of the length of the job, there was nothing to show a visitor. No proud wall standing in the sun, only a line of working sloops and the splash of stone going down, and the knowledge that something vast was taking shape on the floor of the bay. And then, at last, after enough stone had gone down, the top of the wall broke the surface of the water and kept rising, and for the first time, you could stand on the thing the bay had been swallowing for years. When it finally came up into daylight, the top was finished with care. The crews capped the wall with flat, rectangular blocks of cut granite, laid 3 across, a deliberate paved surface wide enough to walk and to work on. The finished top ran about 43 feet wide. Down below, hidden under the water, the base of that same wall spread to an estimated 175 feet across. Think about that shape for a moment. A surface you could drive a wagon along, resting on a foundation more than 4 times as wide, buried in the sea. The part the world would ever see was only the narrow crown of a stone mountain that went all the way down to the harbor floor. If you are new here, and this is the kind of history you have been looking for, the quiet engineering and the named men and the unnamed hands behind the things we take for granted, take a second to subscribe or to join the channel as a member for early access to every new film. It is the simplest way to keep work like this going. This was not the work of a single season or a single contract. The Rockland breakwater was built in stages across almost 20 years under a string of 9 separate contracts, as the money came from Washington in pieces and the wall crept further and further out into the bay. The first of those 9 contracts went to Joseph Bodwell's Bodwell Granite Company of Rockland in 1881, and the early sections under Colonel George Thorne carried the structure out into the harbor block by block. Each time a contract was funded and fulfilled, the wall grew longer, and each time the appropriation ran dry, the work paused, and the town waited for Washington to send more. The last and largest push came at the very end of the century. The 9th contract was the giant of them all. Between June of 1897 and November of 1899, a Boston contractor named Charles S. Souther supplied 415,067 tons of stone to the work, more than half the entire mass of the finished breakwater poured into those final 2 years. That stretch of the job ran under 2 Army engineers, Major R. L. Hoxie and Major S. W. Rossler, with a local inspector named R. Fred Cree watching the stone go down. It was this final contract that carried the wall the last 1,600 feet to its full reach and finally closed out the work that John Newton had first proposed more than 40 years before. And the scale of what they had sunk by then is hard to hold in your head. When the wall was done, it ran 4,346 feet from the shore at Jameson Point out into Penobscot Bay. That is just shy of 7/8 of a mile, close enough to a full mile that people have called it a mile ever since. To build it, they had dropped on the order of 700,000 tons of granite into the sea. The careful counts vary a little, one tally putting it at 697,627 tons, and another at 768,774 tons, but either way the figure is staggering. Nearly 750,000 tons of stone, every ton of it quarried by hand from the islands of Penobscot Bay, hauled to the water on horse-drawn galamanders, carried out on sailing sloops, and lowered block by blind block into the Atlantic until a small Maine lime town had walled off the open sea. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound clean and heroic, and the men who did it would not have recognized that version. Working stone is dangerous work, and working it out over water in all weathers is more dangerous still. The quarries took a steady toll in crushed hands and broken bodies from the moving of heavy stone, and the loading and the lowering of 2-ton blocks off the deck of a sloop in a Maine swell was no gentler. The records that survive are mostly ledgers of tonnage and dollars and contracts, the bookkeeping of a federal project, and they were not kept to remember the men. For most of those who drilled and split and hauled and drowned the stone, the ledger gives no name, only a number. They were counted as labor and paid and replaced, and the wall they left behind is the only monument most of them ever got. The whole undertaking, when it was finished, had cost far more than Lieutenant Newton had ever guessed back in 1856. His original estimate had been about $156,000. The final bill for the breakwater came to roughly $880,093, more than 5 times the first figure. Spread across nearly 20 years and 9 contracts and a generation of stonework. For a small city built on burning lime, it was an enormous sum of federal money to spend on a single wall. But weigh it against what it protected. It guarded a harbor that loaded hundreds of ships a year and shipped 1.5 million barrels of lime, and it bought that harbor calm water that no storm off the bay could take away. Only after the wall itself was nearly complete did the small structure at the end of it go up, and I want to be clear that the structure at the end is not the story. A temporary light had been placed out there as early as 1888 to mark the growing wall for the very ships it was meant to protect, so they would not run onto the stone in the dark. Then, in 1902, a permanent brick and granite light station was finished at the seaward tip, built by a Rockland firm to warn vessels off the end of the breakwater. That little station is the part most people photograph today, the pretty cottage-style light at the end of a long stone path. But the light is a footnote. The achievement is the path. The achievement is the nearly mile-long mountain of hand-cut granite under that lighthouse, sunk into the Atlantic by men with drills and wedges and horses and sloops, holding the ocean off a working harbor. There is one more thing I want you to carry away about the men who made this, because the granite islands of Maine were not just quarries, they were communities. On Vinalhaven at the height of the boom, more than 1,000 men worked the stone, and with them came their wives and children and a whole working town built on cutting granite. They came from across New England and from far across the ocean, from Sweden and Norway, from Scotland and Ireland and Italy, carrying the craft of the chisel and the drill in families that had cut stone for generations in the old country. They built churches and band halls and union lodges on a cold island in Penobscot Bay, all of it paid for by granite. When you look at the Rockland breakwater, you are not looking at an anonymous government project. You are looking at the work of a particular people in a particular place, immigrant stonecutters and Maine quarrymen who turned their islands into the wall that saved the harbor. Most of their individual names did not make it into the record, but the wall is signed in their labor all the same. And here is the part that turns this from history into something you can still go and stand on. The Rockland breakwater is not a ruin, and it is not a memory. It is still there, and it still works. You can park near Jameson Point on a clear Maine morning and walk straight out onto it, nearly a mile of granite reaching into Penobscot Bay, the open Atlantic working away on your right hand, and the calm harbor lying flat on your left, exactly the way the engineers intended. Under your boots are the same flat capstones the crews laid 3 across more than 120 years ago. The walk takes most people the better part of half an hour out and back, and almost no one who makes it understands that they are strolling along the narrow crown of a stone mountain that runs all the way down to the floor of the bay. That wall of dry-laid granite still takes the run of the Atlantic on its long-sloped seaward face, and still leaves calm water behind it in Rockland Harbor, exactly as Colonel George Thorne drew it back when the first sloops began dropping stone. The blocks are where the quarrymen left them. People stroll out to the lighthouse on a summer afternoon with no idea that the broad granite causeway under their shoes is the largest single thing the Lime City ever built, 25. A wall against the sea that has not failed in over a century of storms. The breakwater also marked something larger about how Americans had learned to fight the ocean. By the end of the 19th century, the country had stopped treating its harbors as gifts of geography and started treating them as problems to be engineered. If a harbor was too open, you closed it with stone. If the sea ran in too freely, you built a mountain to stop it. Rockland did it the hardest way there was, with no concrete and no imported material and almost no machinery, just the granite of its own islands and the backs of its own men. The same decades that saw American cities reach into the countryside for their water and string iron across their rivers saw a small Maine town reach into the bottom of its bay and pull up a wall against the Atlantic. It was the same confidence, the same belief that a determined country could rearrange the coast itself if the coast was in the way. I think about what that wall really represents, and I keep landing on the same idea. The Rockland breakwater was not a monument, and it was never meant to be admired. It was a tool, built by a working town to keep working, paid for in 20 years of federal patience and a generation of crushing labor, and it succeeded so completely that it became invisible. Nobody throws a parade for a breakwater. The ships it sheltered are gone. The lime kilns went cold long ago, the last of them dark by the middle of the next century, and the men who sank the stone are mostly nameless. And yet the wall outlasted all of it. The industry it was built to serve has vanished, and the wall is still holding back the sea. Which leaves me with a harder question, and I am going to hand it to you. We tend to assume that the truly massive infrastructure, the kind that fights the ocean and wins, had to wait for steel and concrete and powerful machines that you could not really build against the Atlantic with hand drills and horses and wooden boats. But the men of Rockland did exactly that. They sank 700,000 tons of granite into the open sea with their hands and their oxen and their patience, and the wall they made has held for more than a century against everything the North Atlantic has thrown at it. So here's what I keep wondering. If a crew today were handed the same problem, the same bay, the same rule, that it must all be local stone set without mortar and without a modern machine to lift it, do you honestly believe we could match what those quarrymen did between 1881 and 1899? I have my own answer. I would like to hear yours down in the comments, because I do not think it is nearly as obvious as we would like to pretend. If you want the deeper origin of all of this, the Erie Canal that this same hard-handed American century dug across New York with shovels and wheelbarrows, the full illustrated story is waiting behind the code on your screen. Scan it, pick it up, and thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I will see you at the next one.